General Jeffrey um, for the Wings episode on the B-17. General, how did you get into the Army Air Corps to begin with? Was there something in your childhood that sparked an interest, or what?
I was attending school at the Virginia Military Institute, and in 1937, at a field camp at Fort Hoyle, Maryland, there was an Army airplane sitting on the ground there, and I drove over to it and was met by the pilot. And while admiring the airplane, the first one that I had ever gotten close to or ever touched, the pilot asked me if I would like to go fly in it. So I told him that I would like that very much. It was a two-seat airplane. It turned out to be a Northrop A-17. It was equipped with chemical tanks, smoke tanks. We took off and went out and dropped smoke on the Army troops that were around in the Aberdeen Proving Ground area, which impressed me very much because the day before I had been one of those people on the ground. We came back in and landed, and that was my first flight, my first contact with an airplane.
So when you made it over to East Anglia, it was the summer of '43, right?
That's right.
You were first assigned to the 390th as the deputy commander. Describe that assignment.
Might I back up a moment?
Sure.
Upon just before graduation from VMI, I had the opportunity to take a physical examination to possibly go to the flying school, the Army Air Corps Flying School at Randolph Field in Texas. I had no idea that I could learn to fly. On the other hand, I was accepted, and I went there. And to my surprise, I graduated from the flying school in the bombardment course. I mention this because it is significant in connection with the rest of my flying career. I was subsequently stationed at Langley Field, Virginia, in a reconnaissance squadron, and then at the Miami 36th Street Airport. Obviously, somebody in the hierarchy was thinking about the possibility of war to move a squadron to Miami. I subsequently went to Puerto Rico, stayed there for 3 years, was married there, and was there when World War II broke out. From there, I moved to Panama and then to Guatemala, where I first became acquainted with the B-17 airplane. I was checked out in the B-17 at Guatemala, where we flew submarine patrols to the Galapagos Islands. I subsequently was ordered back to the United States to attend the Bombardier School, which took place, and I reported to Spokane, Washington, and was assigned a job with the 34th Bomb Group in Spokane. We subsequently moved to Blythe, California on account of the weather. The 34th Bomb Group produced new bomb groups, one a month, the cadre of a bomb group, one a month, and I thought that anything was better than what I was doing, trying to train those people. So I became the deputy group commander of the next group to be formed from the 34th Bomb Group, which turned out to be the 390th. That's a long story, but it is a lead-in to how I happened to get with the 390th. We formed the 390th, went back to Spokane and Great Falls, Montana, and I led the 48 airplanes of the 390th Bomb Group from Montana to East Anglia in England. We made it over there without any untoward incidents happening.
While you were backing up, you reminded us that all right, are we back? Are we running? Okay. I just wanted to ask you, your first experience with the B-17, you said, was in Guatemala.
Yes.
What struck you about the airplane? What do you remember? What did you think of it?
Well, having been a bomber pilot, I had flown B-18s, which was the Douglas bomber version of a DC-3 for a considerable number of hours, probably 1,000 hours. So I was not unfamiliar with the bomber type of airplane. I was greatly impressed with the B-17. On my first flight, after being checked out, as a matter of fact, 2 days later, I took off from Guatemala with a full load of bombs and a crew and lost an engine on the takeoff on the B-17 the first time I had the opportunity to fly it. The airfield in Guatemala is 5,000 feet long and 5,000 feet high, and I managed to get the airplane back around on the ground in one piece without wrapping it up. The fact that the airplane really took me around rather than me taking it around impressed me greatly. And when I got on the ground, thinking I had done a good day's work, the operations officer said, "We've got another airplane ready, take this one." So I flew it to Guatemala, and subsequently, I spent a great deal of my life in the cockpit of a B-17.
Let's talk about that. You got to East Anglia in the summer of '43, and you were deputy commander and pilot, right?
That's correct.
And you were on some rather significant missions. But first, describe for me what it's like being a deputy commander or commander of a bomb group.
It's a bit difficult to describe. Your basic concern, one's basic concern as the commander or the deputy commander of a bomb group, is not one's safety in flight on a combat mission, but instead to be able to successfully accomplish the mission with the minimum loss, first to get as many bombs on the target as possible, and 2, with the minimum loss of life, and 3, minimum loss of equipment. So therefore, with that said, the commander or the deputy commander's principal concern is with the people that are doing the flying, the airplanes, to see that they're in the proper shape to conduct the mission, and then to see that the people are properly trained in order to accomplish the things that I just mentioned.
How did the B-17 as a piece of equipment help accomplish those 3 objectives?
Well, the B-17, in my opinion, is a very forgiving airplane. You could look off some direction or other, you could be doing something else, and the airplane would continue flying, and it was exceedingly dependable. As a matter of fact, if you did something wrong, the airplane generally corrected your problem. It was reliable. It would bring you home on 3 engines or 2 engines, and I've seen them come in with only 1 engine. If you had to land with your wheels up, it landed all right with the wheels up. And it could take an incredible amount of, sustain an incredible amount of damage and still fly. Okay, you asked the question, and then it'll be a brief answer, but
sure.
It is a significant answer because it had to do with my thinking about the way we conducted our operations over there.
All right, well, tell me about the first mission.
Well, at the time that I arrived over there, the commander, the deputy commander of a bomb group, I believe each one of the squadron commanders, as well as the group operations officer, were required to fly on one mission with some other group just to become acquainted with what went on under these conditions. So the mission that I flew was with the 95th Bomb Group, which was a member of another group in our combat wing. And I recall that I rode on the airplane as an observer. I would like to emphasize something that impressed me greatly in connection with this mission. One, we took off, and all of the instruments in the airplane worked perfectly. I don't think I'd ever seen an airplane that had all of the airplanes working so good. It reflected upon the maintenance people of the group and what a fine job that they were doing. Our target was, I think, Rostock in Germany. We crossed the English Channel, and about the time we got to Bremen, a swarm of German fighters came up, and we turned around and went back to England. And I thought, my goodness, we have chickened out on this mission. It was a planned operation. The German fighters came up after us. They followed us partway back to England. They turned around and went back to Germany, and we turned around and overflew the base from which the fighters had taken off and went on up to Rostock and bombed it. An anti-aircraft shell hit the number 2 wingman and destroyed it on the way back, and my reaction was, let's get the hell out of here. So this was an important event in connection with my future activities over there in England.
And then moving forward in time, what happened September 6th? Describe that.
The mission to Stuttgart, let's see, at that time, we didn't have any significant fighter support. I don't recall whether there were any U.S. fighters over there or not, but we had a squadron of Spitfires, RAF airplanes that escorted us part way. The rest of the flight was unescorted, and we were under attack by the German Air Force throughout the entire flight, which in duration was down and back was about 7 hours. When the weather was good on the mission, as we got to the initial point, that's the point from which a bomb run is started. We refer to it as the IP. En route from the IP to the target became obscured with clouds. We could no longer see the target. We could see smoke coming up where other airplanes had bombed the target, but we could no longer see it. So the question was, do we just go over and drop the bombs blindly, or do we go over the target and go to a secondary target, which was Strasbourg? I elected to fly over the target and not drop the bombs, but instead to proceed to Strasbourg. We left the rest of the 8th Air Force, went to Strasbourg, and dropped the bombs successfully on the marshalling yards there. But in doing so, we got far behind the rest of the 8th Air Force, and we could see them dimly off in the distance. 2 of our airplanes had lost engines. We're flying on 3. And to try to catch the Air Force would have meant accelerating and losing the 2 airplanes that we had. The alternative was to slow down, since I didn't think we could catch them anyway, which we did. We slowed down and kept the other airplanes with us, and the rest of the Air Force was under severe attack up ahead of us. We could see that happening, but somehow or other the Germans didn't know that we were behind, and we followed them all the way back to England and didn't have anybody shoot at us at all.
Was that Stuttgart mission, for some reason, by historians, military historians, described as something of a disaster?
I haven't heard it described that way.
I may be mistaking it.
It might have been considered that in view of a, let's say, not knowing exactly what the weather was going to be, and therefore losing a lot of airplanes, and then maybe not bombing the target successfully on account of the weather after we got down there. So one might consider it that way.
You led a significant mission for the history of the 8th Air Force, and that was the second Schweinfurt raid on October 14th of 43. But describe why that mission was important and what happened and how it figured into our bombing campaign.
Yes. Earlier on, I think back in the 30s sometime, the Air Corps it was called the Air Force Tactical School at Montgomery, Alabama, had done some studies looking into what might be considered some of the most potentially important targets in a bombardment campaign to any country, and I don't think necessarily at that time Germany was considered possibly as a potential adversary. Uh, but in studying the problem, they took a look at the United States as a target for some other enemy, and the question was asked, what might be the most of the targets that could have the most impact on the United States if they were destroyed? And the rail system and the electrical systems and this sort of thing were selected. But in looking over industry in general in the United States, they found out that there was one item, the ball bearing, which was essential in all industrial equipment. And in the United States, as I recall, they were only made in one place. And I think it might have been New Departure, and you can correct me if I'm wrong in that, someplace out in Indiana, Illinois. So with that in mind, and looking at Germany, we found that all of the ball bearings, or essentially all of them in Germany, were produced at a city called Schweinfurt, at a factory called Schweinfurt. So this was the center of the ball bearing industry in Germany, and so it was for that reason, the studies earlier on, that the attacks on Schweinfurt took place. In case of the October 1943 attack, I believe we had been there one time before, earlier on a combination raid with Regensburg airplane factories and Schweinfurt, and I'm not sure how successful we had been on accomplishing that. Our group flew on the mission, which went on to Africa. It was led by General LeMay. I didn't fly on that mission, as we rotated lead from time to time. On the October 1943 mission, I must say that one of the reasons that this mission was of such importance, not necessarily to the whole Air Force, but to those of us, to the United States effort, but to those of us who participated, was that during the early weeks of October 1943, the 390th Bomb Group, the 100th and the 95th, and other groups of the 8th Air Force had flown one mission to Bremen. The weather was clear, and we had lost 6 airplanes from the 390th Bomb Group, 6 out of a total of 36 that we had at the time. This was 6 of the original crew. A very few days later, we went to Munster, and the 13th Combat Wing lost 26 to fighter activity almost alone. The 390th lost 8 of 18, which was almost half of our force, and the 100th lost all except 1 airplane. And Rosenthal, whom I believe you interviewed today, was the only survivor, or the only airplane that returned from Schweinfurt. The other group lost 6. So with this as a lead-in, our next target, after one interim mission to Marienburg, was to Schweinfurt, and our force was almost depleted. So that is a sort of a background of what we got into, or how we looked at the Schweinfurt mission.
Yeah, tell me about the mission Schweinfurt 2 specifically. Let's start with the briefing. Were you at a briefing of the 390th? Did you give some of the briefing and announce to the crews where they were going? How did they react?
I conducted the briefing, or a portion of the briefing, regarding the Schweinfurt mission, as I had stayed up all night, I think, or most of the night, studying the field order, and being one of the few that knew at the time exactly where we were going to go that next morning. During the night, after the field order came in, the officer that was going to lead the 3rd Air Division, General Archie Old, called on the telephone to the 2 wing commanders. I was to be one, and I had forgotten the name of the other. We got on a telephone, on a scrambled telephone conversation, and he indicated that this was going to be exceedingly rough, and our success was going to depend, that is, survival was going to depend to a great extent on the sort of formation that we flew and how good we were in flying the formation. There was to be a what we called a dog leg in the route in, where we would come into a point, make almost a 90-degree turn to the right, go for 5 or 10 minutes, make a 90-degree turn to the left. We talked about procedures for accomplishing those turns without breaking up our formation and so forth ahead of time. At the briefing, when I announced to the group that we were going to Schweinfurt, a rather significant groan came up among the crews, because these were the same people, the remaining people that had been to Munster and been to Bremen, that sort of thing. So also, the 100th Bomb Group was unable to put up a group. So in the 13th Combat Wing, we only had 2 groups, and the 100th filled in. The 95th and the 390th were the 2 groups, and the 100th filled in some spare places in each the 95th and the 390th. So that's the way it looked before we took off. We got off all right, assembled, crossed the channel, and some Spitfires and an early on squadron of P-47s escorted us part way, and at the point that the fighters had to turn around and go back to England, we could look up and see the Luftwaffe all circling at 30,000 feet, and we waved goodbye to our fighters, and then down came the Luftwaffe, so we had a good gunnery exercise for the rest of the day. Our bombing, the bombing of the 95th and the 390th was turned out to be excellent. We put, as I recall, the 390th, 90% of the bombs within 1,000 feet of the target, which was exceedingly good. We only lost 1 airplane on that mission out of the 390th Bomb Group, and we received the Presidential Unit Citation as a result of our bombing effort on that day. So from our viewpoint, it was rough, but it wasn't that rough, and it was a highly successful mission from the viewpoint of how many bombs we put on target. Incidentally, as a little epitaph, in 1986, I was back in Germany, and I decided to visit Schweinfurt. And I went down and visited the ball bearing factory in 1986 just to see what it looked like, and it had been put back together, and Schweinfurt was all back together again.
You were assigned at a certain point, or you moved, or you took over the command of the 100th.
Yes.
At a point. How did that transpire? What's the story behind it? Tell us that.
One day at the 390th Bomb Group, as has been indicated, I was the deputy group commander. And this was in sometime in May of 1944. I received a telephone call. Somebody did on the base, and they said, General LeMay would like to speak to you on the telephone. General LeMay was the commander of the 3rd Air Division, and rather a strict disciplinarian and that sort of thing. When I was told that he wanted to speak to me on the telephone, my immediate reaction was, what have I done wrong recently? But in picking up the phone, I was asked the following statement was made by General LeMay with a question. He said, Jeffrey, I need a group commander at the 95th Bomb Group and the 100th Bomb Group. You can take your choice. I asked him if I could think about that for a little bit and call him back, and he said yes. So the 95th could essentially do no wrong. They lost the minimum number of airplanes. Their bombing record was good. The 100th, on the other hand, was just the other way. They didn't do as well. And I figured that I could do more for the 100th than I could for the 95th. So I called him back, the General LeMay back, and I told him with his permission, I would accept the 100th Bomb Group. And I asked him, when do you want me to report? And he said, this afternoon. So that's how I got there.
he kind of expected that you would pick the.
I think he said, as I recall, I thought maybe you would when I told him that I would take the 100.
So you took the tough assignment. What was it like when you got to the 100?
Well, since, as I have mentioned, the 13th Combat Wing, and I didn't lead into this in detail, but the Air Force, the 8th Air Force was broken up into air divisions, divided into air divisions, and subsequently divided into combat wings. The combat wing, the 13th Combat Wing, of which I was a part, with the 390th, the 95th, and the 100th, we, the three groups, always flew together. Therefore, whenever I was flying with the 390th, I was looking out the window of the airplane at the 100th. And as a general rule, the 100th was pretty well scattered out over the sky. So I was not unfamiliar with their how they acted in the sky, and I had believed that discipline, air discipline, reflects ground discipline, and I had sort of, I believe that the poor formations of the 100th reflected poor discipline on the ground, and so my actions when I got to the 100th Bomb Group was, as we might say, get them to straighten up and fly right, or as the Navy says, ship up or ship out. So it was to bring VMI into the picture and teach the people, get the people to know who was leading the group. And
do you remember some of your first actions?
The first action was to call General LeMay and ask him if he would take stand down the 100th Bomb Group for 2 days. Stand down means to take them take the 100th off of operations, in order that we could fly formation. And he granted that. And so for the next 2 days, 4 hours in the morning and 4 hours in the afternoon, we flew every airplane in the 100th Bomb Group in formation. I had an airplane that I had and crew that I'd borrowed from the 390th Bomb Group that came over with cameras to take pictures of the formation that the 100th was flying, in order to pinpoint the people who were not flying formation. And I had people in the tail gunner's position of the lead airplane photographing the formation so that we could identify who was flying good and who wasn't. And then I took an old airplane and circled around the formation back and forth and tried to herd them into position. So at the end, 2 days of this, the 100th was flying the best formation that I have ever seen. And I led the 100th in a low-level pass over the 390th and the 95th at 500 feet with 36 airplanes, just to let the other two groups see who they would be flying with in the future.
So you've made it to the 100, and you've stood them down for 2 days, and you've got them flying the best formations you've ever seen. And the time has come for the ground invasion. You don't know that. Give me the story, starting with the summons to a late-night meeting with General LeMay.
All right. I had been had flown a mission the day before the D-Day landings. I had flown over to France to drop some bombs on some target or other. And when I returned, I was met at the airplane and told that I was to report to General LeMay's headquarters at the division headquarters at Elverton Hall that evening, and to wear sidearms. By that meant to come armed. I had no idea why I would have been summoned there and summoned with directions to be armed. So I did as told, and I got my .45 underneath my blouse and a shoulder holster, and went to, the driver took me to Elberton Hall, where I found that all of the other group commanders of the 3rd Air Division were either there or were being assembled. And when we were assembled in General LeMay's briefing room, he marched in and announced to us that the Allied forces would land on the beaches of Normandy the next morning, and he designated the hour. And this was the first that any of us were aware or had been told that this event was going to occur. We all smiled because this was the day that we had been looking for. It meant to us that the end of the war was somewhere in sight, where the day before that wasn't necessarily so from our viewpoint. General LeMay had a background map of where the landings were going to take place, the nature of the force that was going to land, the aircraft that were going to be involved in getting them ashore, which was the entire 8th Air Force and the 9th Air Force and the RAF, and I guess any other outfit that could fly an airplane. He made a remark in this regard, in regard to the use of air forces on the coming day, and I can almost quote him directly. He said, "Gentlemen, in order for you to thoroughly understand the importance of this occasion tomorrow, that the 8th Air Force will expend every airplane that it has in its inventory to ensure that those troops get ashore, to and include strafing the beaches or strafing the enemy with the B-17s at a low level." So with that said, we were aware then, told of what time we were to take off, which as I recall was 1:30 in the morning for the 100th Bomb Group. And so I then, I guess, concluded as to why we had come up there armed. I'm still not sure, but it was since we had such valuable information at our disposal, I guess we were supposed to either shoot whoever asked us for it or shoot ourselves rather than to give it away. So I can continue on with the briefing if you would like.
Could you restate, just to make sure that we have two versions to use on camera for best editing? Give me again, quoting General LeMay. He's got you something and he makes the announcement. What did he say?
After having given us indicated that the Allied forces were going to land the following morning at Normandy, and pinpointing the actual locations, he indicated to us that this event was of such significance that if necessary, every airplane in the 8th Air Force would be expended in order to get the Army troops ashore, and if necessary, we would use the B-17s along with the B-24s and fighters to strafe the beaches with our machine guns to be sure that these people got ashore.
Now you got back to your bomb group and had to conduct follow-on briefing.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, this was to be, as you might expect, a maximum effort. So normally, generally, we didn't put up every airplane that we had to fly because we would let one squadron stand down normally to rest the squadron and rotated those. On this occasion, it was what we called a maximum effort, which meant that we would fly every airplane that was flyable and every crew that was flyable on this mission. And so without telling the ground people, the maintenance people, where we were going and that sort of thing. We had the bomb load and fuel load, but at the briefing, which was early in the morning, I had determined that we were going to have to take off at about 1:30 in the morning. Therefore, we had to get the crews up at about 12 o'clock at night. And with the briefing room full of air crews, let me see, I had the privilege of announcing to them that we were going to, that there was going to be a D-Day landing the following, or that morning, at Normandy. And a great cheer went up from the crews because they too realized that the beginning of the end was in sight.
Okay, so D-Day happens. Did you actually, were you in the air on D-Day?
Yes, I led the 100th Bomb Group, and I don't know whether we were leading the wing or not. I think maybe we were, but I led the 100th Bomb Group on the mission. We had to assemble at night, and that's not the easiest thing that we ever did, because you have to shoot flares, and each group has a different colored flare so that you can identify, that each airplane can identify his leader by the color of the flare he's shooting, so we have to get together in the dark. But we were assembled and got together with the whole 8th Air Force, and as we proceeded down toward Normandy at a low altitude, we didn't, I think we were 12,000 feet or something, we didn't go in high. The upstairs weather wasn't too good, but I think we would have stayed down anyway. I was impressed as we approached the Normandy coast with the vast array of aircraft that one could see looking out of the window. They were ahead of us, above us, behind us, below us, and everywhere. This whole sky was filled with airplanes. Most impressive sight. Most impressive sight.
How did your command and how did the tactical use of the B-17 progress after D-Day?
Well, we immediately after D-Day changed the target structure was changed as a significant portion of the 8th Air Force and practically all of the 9th Air Force was used to try to get the ground troops off of the beaches and out of the Normandy area. So we did a significant amount of low altitude bombing of close-in targets to the ground troops, as well as we could identify them, and to attack the rail centers and bridges and that sort of thing, to try to trap the German ground forces, and at the same time to try to get our people off of the beaches. And once this occurred, then our bombing, once they were free, we went back to the strategic bombing effort generally that we'd had before, but we did continue to bomb targets, bridges, and railroad yards, and that sort of thing, close into the troops.
Did we have air superiority after D-Day?
We had one of the major purposes of the objectives of the 8th Air Force in England during its tenure, and one that possibly hasn't been discussed too much, was that of attaining air superiority over Europe, or air superiority over the Luftwaffe. This, I won't say whether this was a primary objective of the 8th Air Force, but it might well have been, because we were aware, as the air power enthusiasts are aware, that no land invasion can occur unless air superiority has been achieved. So had it not been achieved, I would say that those landings on D-Day would not have been possible. This fact, and I say fact, was borne out uh, uh, when on the morning of D-Day, the Luftwaffe was not in appearance. There wasn't, as I can recall, a single German fighter airplane in sight. So it wasn't then a matter of was air superiority achieved prior to after D-Day. It had been achieved prior to D-Day. This doesn't mean that we didn't have further opposition on missions that we flew, because there were plenty of fighters left. They just weren't up there on D-Day.
When we spoke on the phone a month ago, I guess you defined very nicely for me the concept of air power in sort of a historical context. I'm wondering if we can get that on tape, it's important to the story here.
Well, this is a kind of deep subject to go into on a short notice, but to be, without talking at length, but to try to cover it as well as I can, and briefly. Since the beginning of time, wars have been fought by opposing armies, opposing navies. Defending shores, people beating each other over the head with clubs, or sticking each other with spears, or shooting each other with rifles, or shooting at each other with bows and arrows, and this sort of thing. By and large, the civilian populations and the nations involved, nations concerned, have not been directly involved in any of the wars from Alexander the Great to Genghis Khan, any of them. The same thing was true generally with all the wars that have existed. With the advent of the airplane, this scenario changed. And the air power enthusiasts then look at not just the armed forces of an opposing nation, but the total strength structure of a nation that would permit it to carry out war. The basic elements of power of a nation, and these are not in the order of priority in which I will give them, but one of the fundamental elements of power, one of the four, is a nation's economic structure. In other words, it's a how viable is it? What sort of condition is it in to support a war? Number two, the political structure of the nation. How stable is it? Is the form of government such that it can carry out a war with determination? Item number three is military structure. What sort of military forces does the nation have? And four, the nation's moral fiber. What will does it have to carry out a war? For the first time on the history of the earth, air power is able to get at all of these elements of power. And that was the objective of the 8th Air Force's campaign, to get at the political structure of Germany, its economic structure, its infrastructure, its military structure, and thereby destroying to the maximum extent the moral fiber of the nation. And to indicate something that I might have to you the other day, in furtherance of this objective, frequently at night, we would send a lone B-17 at a very high altitude with one or two 2,000-pound bombs with a fire siren connected to the tail of the bomb, and drop it, let's say over Munich, and the fire siren could be heard, I guess, for miles around as this massive bomb approached the city. And needless to say, there wouldn't be many people awake and that would stay awake in Munich during the night when that sort of thing occurred. So the idea was to keep them awake, to let the moral fiber get the moral fiber down so that they would no longer support a war. Does that sort of cover what you had in mind?
That's exactly. Tell me about Rosie Rosenthal, and let's end the story on. I want to get to his being shot down over. Well, he was shot down twice.
All right. When I arrived at the 100th Bomb Group, Rosie Rosenthal, Bob Rosenthal, was a member of the 100th Bomb Group, a highly respected member of the 100th Bomb Group. He had flown a lot of missions, and he'd flown a lot of difficult missions. And on an occasion of the Munster mission in October of 1943, to which I referred earlier, when I said that only one airplane of the 100th returned, Rosenthal was the man that was flying that airplane that came back on that day. So he had seen his share of rough times. I had met him before. As a matter of fact, knew him pretty well. And Rosie continued to fly after I arrived. On a bit of a humorous note, Rosenthal wore what we used to call a 50 mission hat, which was a rather disreputable hat, and it was some sign of achievement if one could wear the most disreputable hat. And one might recall that this didn't just prevail in the 100th Bomb Group, but throughout with most of the flyers in the Army Air Corps. I think that my hat was just about as disreputable as his. And one morning at breakfast, when Rosenthal was going to lead a mission somewhere that I've forgotten, he showed up without his hat, and I asked him about it, and he said he'd lost his hat. And so I told him, took mine off and put it on his head and said, "You can wear mine for good luck." Well, that turned out to be something less than the case, as Rosie got shot down that day. And he crashed in France, but he survived the crash landing successfully. Well, by that I mean he lived through it, even though he had a lot of broken bones, legs and arms and ribs and things. And he got back. Excuse me. He got back to England, and I went to see him in the hospital. And he was all strapped up. And he told me, he said, "Colonel, I lost your hat." And I said, "Well, I feel pretty bad about that." He said, "I'll send home to my mother in New York, and she will send us 2 new ones," which he did. They were so military that we couldn't be seen wearing them around the base without having flushed them down to John once or twice to get them so that they were disreputable enough. So Rosie survived that one.
How was he able to get back into missions after that? I thought that if you were shot down and the underground helped you get back to safety, that Germans knew this and you were therefore there was a danger that you might reveal secrets if you were ever caught again, and yet somehow Rosenthal was able to fly again.
Well, you were right about that. On the other hand, in Rosenthal's case, I'm not sure that it was the underground that helped him back. I kind of believe, I do believe that he might have crash landed in what would then have been friendly territory or territory over which our troops had run, and therefore he was picked up by our people rather than the underground and brought back to England. So he didn't. That would not have been a situation where we'd have compromised the security. When Rosie got out of the hospital, I had him transferred to what I considered to be a ground job in wing headquarters so that he would not have to fly anymore, because it occurred to me that he'd already done his job, and he could recuperate in safety. Some weeks later, I received a call from Rosenthal indicating that he would like to have his job back. And so I would be happy to have him if he would be happy to come. So he came back down and joined the group and continued to fly. And sometime, as I recall, in February of 1945, he was shot down again over Berlin this time. And when he parachuted out, I think he broke his arm, maybe at the time of when he landed, but he landed in Russian territory. And eventually, through the aid of the Russians, managed to get back to Moscow, where I received a message from him saying, "Hold my job open, I'll be back in a few days."
Y'all thought you had lost him for sure.
Thought we lost him that time.
Did you ever deal with any mad gunners or pilots that could no longer fly? You know, people who just lost it. Could you describe what that meant to them?
Yeah, this was a problem that all commanders had to deal with, because there are some people whose chemical and mental makeup is such that they just can't stand this sort of thing, and they're not people to be criticized, and they're not necessarily people to be pitied, but they just can't do the job, and this sort of thing. And it turns out, as you can understand, that it's not desirable to keep people like that around in a combat environment, because there are others that are doing this day after day. So when one or more people demonstrate this kind of a trait, it's necessary to move them on, or to move them away. I can recall one such occasion, one of, I won't say many, but one of several, where a relatively senior officer, somebody reported to me that a relatively senior officer, a major as a matter of fact, who had recently come into the group, had evidenced signs of fear while flying. He had put his hands over his face and tried to get down behind the seat or something of that nature. And I requested that he be observed without his knowledge on a couple of missions, as it was a requirement at that time, where we required that any newcomer, a senior newcomer, fly 5 missions as an observer or as a co-pilot prior to the time that he was put in charge of a flight. The reports that I got indicated that this officer had evidenced the same sort of conditions. So I called him in and confronted him with this. He admitted that, indicated that he couldn't take it. And I told him that I'd give him an opportunity to see if he could overcome this by flying 3 or 4 missions. And I talked to him again. And after 3 or 4 missions, he couldn't correct the situation. And so it was necessary to take some drastic action in this regard, due to the fact that this was a senior officer. Action that I won't say that I have regretted, but action that I had to take. We had him court-martialed and removed from flying status, demoted to the grade of private, and sent away from the organization. This is rather a difficult thing to have to do. Maybe there are other ways to get around it, but that's the way we handle this one. And that also impresses others who might be so inclined.
Was it true that crews on a 25th mission might get a milk run?
Well, that depends on how you define a milk run, but let's say that on the 25th mission, we would try to send the crew on an easy one. rather than one that we considered to be exceedingly difficult. So I would say that when possible, we'd send them on a milk run.
Getting back to the B-17, 3 minutes. Getting back to the B-17 as an airplane. After D-Day, and, well, even earlier when you had the long-range fighter support, did you change your tactics as how you flew as a bomb group and as a combat wing since you had long-range escort support? Did that alter how you flew formation?
I wouldn't say that it influenced our tactics. It did occur that at the time that we began to get in significant numbers of fighters that could escort us on longer distances, we also began to get in more bombers and more replacement crews. So as the size of the fighter force built up, the size of the bomber force built up, so our formations changed, from flying a 21 airplane formation, we went to flying a 36 airplane formation, and in order to do that, we had to change the formation to fly in 3 12-ship squadrons, one 12 airplane squadron, one 12 airplane squadron, and another 12 airplane squadron. We could present more firepower with more airplanes. On the other hand, we had more targets too for the enemy fighters. But I wouldn't say that our tactics changed. They remained essentially the same. Needless to say, we were happy to see the fighters.